Hey guys, so I hope that you find this video educational. We're going to attempt to do here is to describe some patterns that exist kind of in our society. And when we say patterns, we're obviously there's always exceptions to the rule. There's always reasons why it isn't what we're talking about. So the advantage of understanding a pattern is just simply that you can take an understanding of the mechanisms of how something is working, and you can throw it up on the board, and we collectively can become allies against the pattern, as opposed to kind of being locked within that pattern, over and over and over again. So the pattern that we want to discuss today, when we're talking about in the realm of relationship transformation, is we want to talk about what I call the little boy syndrome. And the little boy syndrome is something that I use to describe a certain variety of masculine toxicity. But in order to understand how this kind of shows up, you got to kind of back up, and we have to kind of go over the history of this. And there's a lot of examples throughout the history of mankind, but we have some very specific examples that can kind of show you this process of how we got to where we are. Like over 100 years ago, we had two major world wars. We had a lot of other wars also, and back in those days, and these days women go to war also, but in those days, most of the time it was men that went off to war. And so as they went off to war, a lot of those men actually died in battle, and they didn't come back. And of the men that did come back, there are just an enormous amount of those men that came back that did not fully come back mentally and emotionally. We now call that post-traumatic stress. They used to call it shell shock. There's a lot of different reasons why people that came back weren't able to function in a state of flow. And so they simply weren't present, mentally and emotionally in the way that maybe they were before. And so we have these generations of women, heroic women that basically, had already, while their men were either gone or, stepped in to take on that vacuum of energy that masculinity had previously, or in a healthy situation would have interjected their strength into. And so when we look at this, we want to describe to people what are the different types of energies. And when we use the word energy, we're not talking about gender, like we're going to talk about masculine energy and feminine energy. We're using it to describe characteristics. So it's not gender, but characteristics. And the reason why we're using it to describe characteristics is because, in a bell curve and kind of a natural distribution, we know that the majority of the population is heterosexual. But we also have, kind of our outliers of, transsexual, homosexual, where, the science is showing that literally in utero, there is a different neural wiring that has occurred. And we can map this across a lot of different spectrums to show that there's a brain function that actually works in a different way. So when we're looking at the majority of the population and we talk about feminine energy, we are generally talking about women, but not always. And vice versa, when we're talking about masculine energy, we are majority talking about men, but not always. So we'll leave it there. So when we want to discuss these two different types of characteristics, let's get into some descriptions. So when we talk about masculine energy is it's an external energy. It's like a mountain. It's very protective. It protects everything. It protects externally everything that's internally important to it. And so it protects, it defends, it basically takes care of everything that's within its realm. So it definitely shows up. It's very present. That is another quality of masculine energy. So by contrast, feminine energy is very internal. And I'm going to throw some metaphors around to kind of help describe this. And again, there's always exceptions to the rule. But generally, feminine energy has a nest. It has a womb. It has a circle of influence. And one of the differences between masculine and feminine energy is that feminine energy naturally, in its authentic form, nurtures everything that's within that circle of influence. So it doesn't mean that women can't go external. By all means, they certainly can. It's just that it's not where if their authentic core is feminine energy, it's not where they would truly prefer to be. They absolutely can go external. So, over 100 years ago, you've got this this process where men were coming back home, or they weren't coming back at all, or they weren't present, so there was a vacuum. So women stepped in and basically became the protectors, became the defenders, engaged in that external energy in order to take care of the family, because the men simply couldn't do it or wouldn't do it, or there was some vacuum there. So we now know that if we look at studies on children of Holocaust survivors, we know that children of Holocaust survivors are prone to PTSD and anxiety. Now, they're prone to that not because obviously they went through the same traumas, because they didn't. The war ended and everybody was able to go home. The reason why they're prone to PTSD and anxiety is because they were modeled the triggers that came after those traumas. And so we can now make these statements that we can map generational trauma that kind of travels, based off of what is modeled in triggers. And so let's dive into that just a little bit more, from a child development standpoint. From the ages of in utero to 2, now, there's a lot of different brain activity that's going on for all of us all the time, but there are some dominant, very active brain activities that are common to certain ages. And between in utero to 2, a very active brain activity is delta. So for you and I, delta brain activity as adults would be kind of like, a hard sleep. For an infant, there is no hippocampal volume, so there's no memory. And so it's kind of like, this baby's behind glass, just during this time making billions and billions and billions of neural connections as it's growing and moving into toddlerhood. And then from the ages of 2 to 7, 2 to 8, we've got a time period where a very dominant brain activity is known as theta. And so for you and I, theta would be what we would call twilight reverie. It's that time period between kind of dream and awake where it's a magical time. So this truly, helps you understand why this is a magic time for kids with fantasy and storybooks and, Easter Bunny and Santa and all this other type of stuff as well. It's also a time period that children can download an enormous amount of data. Like they can just absorb 4 or 5 languages if they were modeled, if they were just around those people speaking those languages as well. So this is in human development, it's a really core time period. Now, other time periods after, still are very influential, but this is a time period where we download an enormous amount of our subconscious processing. And what we mean by subconscious processing, or maybe one of the best examples that I can give of that, would be for us in the States, here, that about at the age of 15, 16, we go through driver's ed training, and you have to learn these things like you get to put your hands at 10 and 2, you got to look in the left hand mirror and the rear view mirror, and if you had the student driver, they've got that brake that they can hit while you're training. So obviously you're learning something new. It could, especially in the fact that you're moving around this 1-ton vehicle, could produce a little bit of anxiety because there's actual fear of safety and doing things right. But now that you've driven maybe 2 years, 4 years, for me 20, 30, 40 years, for some people, we could be driving and have somebody sitting next to us, driving for an hour or 2 down the road, having a good conversation, and wow, do I even know that I'm driving? Because there are literally terabytes of data that are being processed, almost like muscle memory. The brain does what the brain expects to do. The neural system does what the neural system expects to do. That's called the Tetris effect. We'll talk more about how cognitive afterimage works as well. So that's how kind of the subconscious processing works. Now, we used to think that when it came to conscious and subconscious, we used to kind of see that as a 20/80. Kind of like an iceberg. A certain amount was above the surface, and a certain amount, much larger part was below the surface. We now know, as we've been studying neurology and behavior modification, that we're actually looking at a differential of about 1,000,000 to 1. So who we think we are is not really who we think we are. Who we think we are is more who we feel we are. And who we feel we are is really nothing more, the majority of is conditioned autonomic nervous system repetitive behavior. So there's a lot of subconscious data that's going on to how we react on a daily basis. And we develop these patterns of frequency and vibration, and I use the term frequency to describe kind of this scale of like for example, in moods or in states of being down here in hopelessness and despair, and then being able to move up into anger, and then maybe being able to move up into sadness, and then maybe more neutral before going into kind of more, positive aspects of, peace, happy, joy, ecstatic. We don't go from despair to bliss, all in one step. Normally it's kind of this process. And so having these scales that we can take a look at that can kind of give us a subjective unit of distress, or a subjective quantifying way of looking at our states of being, can become very, very helpful, because we can ask, okay, what's here? What's working? What's not working? And what's next? So as we look at this time period of childhood, if you look at what was modeled to someone during that age of, say, 2 and 8, and then you look at what it is that they struggle with in their life, you will see some correlated, things. You will see familiarities almost all the time if you look at what was modeled to them. Like, this is the mommy, this is the daddy, this is who I am, this is how I work with society and how I work with myself, what my beliefs about myself. All of this subconscious processing, you will see some core belief systems that you can transpose and see these patterns of how people struggle with things, over and over and over again. And so a lot of times people are going, gosh, why can't I change this behavior, whether it's diet or exercise or relationship or these different things that we struggle with? And often the answer is because there's an enormous amount of subconscious processing that has been hardwired, neurons that fire together, wire together. And unless there is crisis, or there's an intentional input of new stimulus of information, most people don't move out of their homeostasis, what they have conditioned, more than 5% their entire lives. So, unfortunately, we have a lot of opportunities for crisis where people are almost forced to do that, move out of that by looking at what it is. And pain is the guide that will literally show us what's kind of going on there. So as we look at these patterns of what people struggle for, you can see almost immediately, we can throw some things up on the board. Dad was an alcoholic, therefore I'm an alcoholic. Or, mom was diabetic, therefore I have diabetes. Or dad was a child abuser, therefore I become a child abuser. These are the type of patterns that we can look out in society and see them happening over and over and over again. And the reason is because we literally physically inherit the traumas of our parents. And you can see these processes, these patterns repeat over and over and over again. So back to feminine and masculine energy. When you have had a trauma as a child, or you have been modeled the triggers of trauma as a child, one of the things that occurs after a trauma is that we have a defense mechanism, some form of fight, flight, or freeze that comes on board in order to protect us from what was conditioned via our history of trauma. And those defense mechanisms can provide a lot of different coping mechanisms, some that are sustainable and some that are not sustainable. I would say a not sustainable coping mechanism is a defense mechanism known as projecting. Projecting is where it's not my fault, it's their fault. It's not my fault, it's society's fault. It's, it's the system. It's all these other, it's this aspect of not taking responsibility and being in so much misery inside that in order to cope, we have to take that and put it and project it onto someone else. And it's a successful coping mechanism. But the reason why, and sustaining is really kind of a wrong term to use, but one of the reasons why it's not sustaining is because of the destruction that comes with it. Because if we're blaming other people, that's not going to go so well for our relationships. And we see a lot of examples of this in masculine toxicity, pretty consistently. Okay, so if a man's core energy is masculine, is protector, and he goes through a trauma or he gets modeled something that gives him a defense mechanism, one of the things that we're seeing what's known as a polarity shift. Now, I need to spend a little bit of time describing what a polarity shift is so that you really, truly understand. Let's say that you were a smoker, and the very first time that someone picked up a cigarette to smoke it, what would be a healthy signal in the body? And most people, if they examine that for a little bit, they would say, ooh, I would get nauseous or I would cough. A cough would be a healthy signal going, this is not good for me. So in order to become a smoker, we have to override that signal. And normally it would be some sort of egoic override, like, ooh, I look cool smoking or something like that. And so we override that signal, this is not good for me. And now we flip the polarity. Instead of the coherent signal, this is not good for me, we now have an incoherent signal that's running through our autonomic nervous system that basically says, not only is this good for me, but, I deserve this cigarette, also. So this is how we begin these processes. And if some of those defense mechanisms were modeled to us in childhood, then you can begin to see this behavior modification pattern of habit that can happen in generations and really keep continuing until somebody stops and says, no, I'm gonna heal this. So the same thing happens with masculine and feminine energy. When we have a variety of traumas or modeled trauma that create defense mechanisms, we can see a flip in polarity of masculine and feminine energy and various different aspects in people's lives. So a woman, again, she has, in feminine energy anyway, has that circle, that field of nurture. There's a very big difference between nurture and giving. Giving and nurturing, I really want to kind of create two different definitions. A woman naturally nurtures everything that's within her circle. And one of the best examples I could give for that is if we took a look at, say there's an infant with a loving mother and father on a plane, and they're traveling overseas, and the baby ends up being colicky, and one of the parents stays up all night with the child. Which one? Now, if you answer something other than the mom, you really haven't been paying attention. Now, the father could stay up all night. But honestly, it really depends on whether or not he's paying attention to the signals for the mom, whether he's hooked into her heart watching. That type of nurture doesn't come naturally to men. It's something that we step into if we have to. So there's a very big difference in what comes very naturally to feminine energy. Now, that doesn't mean that men can't have feminine energy. What we're talking about is a characteristic that is normally a core characteristic in an individual. But both of us have, as far as the sexes, we have access to both of those energies. The question is where do we feel most comfortable? And so when a man flips that polarity, he takes his core authentic masculine energy and he puts on what I would call a feminine mask. When he puts on that feminine mask, that internal nurture doesn't show up the same way. Instead of the ability to receive, which is what feminine energy has, he becomes needy, very, very needy. And this is what I refer to as the needy little boy syndrome. So he becomes needy. Now, when he becomes needy, he's certainly not externally protecting. He's not standing up and protecting, her heart in any way. And that really is the task in relationship transformation that I want to move men towards, is this understanding that the number one priority in the relationship is to protect her heart, mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually, financially, in all ways. Doesn't mean that you always have to provide for her in all those ways. It means that the little girl that's hiding behind most women's hearts trusts you in every one of those topics. So when the man becomes needy, there's just not a lot of masculine energy there that's going to attract an authentic feminine woman. So what a man does, and sometimes out of absolute need, is because he can't get what he wants in that feminine energy, is he'll put on what we call a masculine mask. So authentic masculine energy has a feminine mask that's based off of past trauma and defense mechanisms. He will then put a masculine mask on top of that feminine mask, and he's still needy, but he learns that he can take what he wants, he can force, he can cajole, he can charm, he can manipulate in some way to get what he wants that he really needs. And so this is what we call the definition of masculine toxicity. This is where a man, his number one priority is certainly not protecting her heart. It's in getting what he needs. And what we find when we talk about presence and non-presence is the pattern there is that the man can go very internal in a fantasy world and he can be very victimizing, and he can gaslight, the female in a lot of different ways, because he's trying to figure out how to get what he needs. And, we can blame the man for this, but chances are there's a pattern here that showed up from his childhood that he inherited from his mother and father. And the trauma is going to keep continuing until we bring some awareness to this process and we actually do some processing to downregulate and heal the trauma that created this pattern in the first place. And here's the absolute amazing thing. In relationships, in order for there to be an attraction, there has to be a polarity, all right? Now, both men and women can both, be in masculine or feminine energy. And most of us in this society currently, we're spending a lot of time in both. But in order to have that, that sexual chemistry, that real true attraction, then there has to be a polarity. And so if you have a man with a feminine mask or a man with a feminine mask and a masculine mask on top of that, what is he going to attract? And what he's going to attract is he's going to attract a female with a masculine mask or a masculine mask with a feminine mask on top of that. So, in this series, we're going to get into more description about what that means for women, how that shows up, how it seems like we almost have a world that is trying to convince women that they need to be men. And one of the biggest reasons that they're doing that is because the men aren't stepping in to be men. And the reason why men aren't stepping in to be men is because there's trauma. There's generational trauma there that truly does need to be healed. And here's the magic of the whole program. When you heal the trauma, when you heal the difference, whatever it is that's been modeled, if something can be conditioned, it can be unconditioned. When you heal the trauma, then our homeostasis of fight, flight, or freeze defense mechanisms melts, and we flow back into our authentic state where it takes no effort for us to truly be who it was that we are. And so for a man that's been wearing a feminine mask and a masculine mask on top of that most of his life, if you can heal the trauma, he will flow back into an authentic masculine energy where it takes no effort for him to be the mountain, to show up and be the mountain. And here's how masculinity shows up for a woman. What do you need? What do you need? You want me to rip the world down by 9 and build it again by 10? Like, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but that's kind of the energy. It's the hero that's here, that's present, that's showing up to get the job done and engage. And so when you look at these patterns where men have these masks on, you will see these patterns where they don't get things done, they don't engage, they're certainly not paying attention to her heart. And we're going to give a demonstration of this in the next segment where we talk a little bit about the battery, and we use that as a metaphor to go into in-depth analysis of kind of how this pattern works. If this interests you, I can't wait to show you how you address it. There are ways that we now know in somatic techniques, in mindful inquiry, that we now know how to downregulate our system in order to melt those defensive mechanisms that we may have been holding for 20, 30, 40 years in order to flow back into our authentic states of being where it takes no effort to be who you truly are. See you soon, guys.